Hello, ma'am.
Hello, Chandrakant.
Okay, so
Okay.
how are you?
I am doing very well, and how are you?
I'm fine. I'm great. I'm really great. Can you see me?
I can see you just fine.
Okay. Thank you very much. So, should we start?
We should start.
Okay. Hello, and a warm welcome to you, ma'am. You are Dr. Barbara Oakley, New York Times best-selling author of a book called The Mind for Numbers. You are the instructor of world's most popular massive open online course, University of California, San Diego's Learning How to Learn. You are a professor at Oakland University, a Ramón Distinguished Professor of Online Learning at McMaster University. You are a fellow of the American Institute of Medical and Biological Engineering, and your research has been claimed as revolutionary by Wall Street Journal. We are very delighted to have you, ma'am, and we welcome you at the Renaissance Project Intersecting Sciences and Humanities, an initiative of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Technological University, a state technical university of the state of Maharashtra. Welcome you, ma'am.
Oh, thank you so much. It's such a great pleasure and honor to be here, and I'm just thrilled because Dr. Ambedkar has done so much, and I think the university is really it epitomizes everything that he was trying to do in his lifetime. And so I think that's what we're trying to do here today, is to forward and help people so that they can live more fulfilled lives.
Yes. There is no doubt about it, ma'am. Okay, so we should start the interview. Okay. So let us speak about our motto, intersecting sciences and humanities. You have been in the United States Army during the Cold War, and your journey has been from someone who knew about Slavic languages, someone who had a lot of knowledge about arts, and now you are a professor of engineering at Oakland University. So how has this journey been from someone who knew arts to someone who knows science?
It was a difficult journey for me, especially because I hated math and science when I was growing up. So I would be about the last person that you would ever suspect could become a professor of engineering. But I am the real deal. I publish in good journals and so forth, and I really love engineering. But I remember when I was young, I thought, well, since I hate math and science and I can't do them at all, what should I do for a career? And so I thought, I can become maybe a translator. Maybe I could learn a different language. I had never spoken a different language before, so I just thought that would be very exciting. And it's not like India, where I think people commonly speak several different languages, which is really good for the intellect. And anyway, so I didn't know how to learn another language, because in the US, most people just speak English. And at that time, there weren't any kinds of programs to help people learn other languages. But I found out that if you joined the Army, they would pay for you to learn a different language. So I joined the Army, and I picked Russian more or less on a whim. I'm not of Russian heritage. And I studied Russian for a year and a half. And I learned how to learn a language, and I didn't realize that at that time that learning how to learn a language shares a lot in common with learning how to learn in math and science and engineering. And that's a very obvious thing in retrospect, because the way our brains work when we're learning, there's some underlying very important commonalities, no matter what you're learning. And we'll talk about some of those today. But I remember at the same time that I was learning Russian, I would look at equations, for example, like look at a differential equation or an integral, and I just thought, what is that? What does it really mean when you're looking at something that's like an integral? And now I look at it and it's like, well, obviously you're just sort of summing things up on an infinitesimal level. And But at that time, I had no sense of that whatsoever. So when I was motivated in that I began to realize that language and culture are always important, and they're always going to be important. But increasingly in today's society, math and science and analytical skills are also important. So when I had difficulty finding a job when I was going to get out of the service, I began to realize that maybe it would be valuable for me to open my mind a little bit and try to accept and learn in math and science, even though I thought I had no talent for it. So obviously it worked. It was very difficult, but now today I am really glad that I can look at an integral or a derivative or vectors or all these kinds of things and have a sense of what's going on. I feel that it's like a mental gym of sorts that I can think a little bit more intelligently about all sorts of things, even societal issues, just by virtue of the training, if nothing else, in trade-offs and in understanding how things change that this kind of engineering and analytical skills gave me. But I'm very grateful that I also studied in the humanities, because I think I have a great understanding of metaphor and how to creatively join together ideas in really different fields. And that has been very, very helpful for me too. So hopefully that just gives you a little sense of my background and also how both the humanities and the sciences and math have played a role in who I am today.
So it was a kind of a blessing in disguise.
I think that's a good way to put it. I remember when I was in the military, I thought I would go into something to do with language, that they would assign me to that, and they instead assigned me to join a signal battalion that implemented communications equipment. And I thought that was the worst thing that had ever happened to me in my life. I just thought, I can't do this, it's not me, blah, blah, blah. And it turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to me in the long run, because it helped force me to begin to think more broadly and to think about growing as a human being.
James Allen, he wrote a complete book on thinking, As a Man Thinketh. And we believe that everything starts with thinking. Are there different modes of thinking for learning also?
There are different modes of thinking, and I think that once they said something like, any damn fool can make things complicated, it takes a genius to make things simple. And so I'm no genius, but the only way I can really understand things is to make things simple. And so I think it would be valuable for us if I give you some pictures to understand the two primary modes that we have as far as how people learn and think about things. So first off, there's focus mode. So focus mode is one way of thinking about things, and that is when you're really focusing. For example, if you're focusing right now on me, or you may be focusing on your iPhone instead, but that's one way of thinking about things. And often when we learn something, we only think we learn something when we're focusing on it. But there's another mode of thinking and learning, and that is what I'll call the diffuse mode. Let's see if I can bring it up here. There we go. So diffuse mode is sort of the term I use, a catch-all term for the many neural resting states. The most prominent of these resting states is known as the default mode network. But basically you can think of it as there's focus mode, which is very tight. You're like what you would do when you're solving a multiplication problem or doing a differentiation. And diffuse mode, you're thinking, thoughts are in your head, but they're much more random. You're not focusing your thoughts, it's what arises naturally. And you might be in diffuse mode when you're in the shower or going for a walk, riding on a bus somewhere. And the best way to understand these two modes is to use a metaphor. So again, that's drawing on my background from the humanities. But a good metaphor that can be very helpful to understand the difference between these two modes is the pinball machine. And if you're of my age, at least, you would remember that a pinball machine is this device where you pull back on the plunger. That's this part that's on the lower part of the machine table. You pull back on that, and it's got like a spring, and a ball goes bouncing around on these blue rubber bumpers. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that pinball machine, and we're going to put it right on the human brain. So here's the human brain, and you can see the little ears on the side and the nose at the top and the brain in the middle. And I'm going to put the pinball machine on the brain. So there we go. There's the pinball machine on the brain. And so what we can do is, a lot of times what happens is you'll have patterns that have already been laid. So let's say that you already know multiplication. So you'll have some patterns you've laid in your brain that allow you to, like let's say if I said, I want you to multiply 43 times 77. Well, your thoughts would move right along those patterns that you've already laid. Now, let's say though, that you're trying to learn something completely new that you've never learned before. So let's say you know multiplication, but you don't know division. So division is like a pattern that is going to be put somewhere in your brain, but you have no idea where it's going to go, how to put it there, how to get there, how to use it. In fact, how do you learn something completely new? It turns out what you often do is you begin by looking at kind of using patterns you've already used before. So let's say you're starting to try and do a division problem. You'll look at it and you'll kind of automatically go back to those multiplication problems that you've already known how to do. And so what happens is after a little while that you find that you're not able to solve the problem because you're not using the right pattern, and you begin to get really frustrated. And when you get frustrated, you often close the book, and I'm talking about multiplication and division right now, but let's say that you have already learned differential calculus, right? But you're now trying to learn integral calculus, or vice versa. So you begin to try and do the new techniques, but you get stuck. And you get frustrated. You're reading the book, and the book seems almost deliberately designed to make it harder for you. So you close it, you walk away, and maybe you go do something. You might study something different, or you might go out and do a little soccer or something, football of that sort. When you come back, oddly enough, things seem to make more sense. What seemed impossible to understand at first begins to make, it seems much more clear. Why is that? It's because when you walked away and when you really let your mind get off of what you were focusing on, it opens up a completely new mode, a new pattern. And this new modality, this other modality of thinking, is much more broad-ranging. So when you think a thought, it goes much more widely. It can't do a meticulous, focused problem solving as you can in the focus mode, but at least you can get to the new place that you want to be in order to solve that problem. So often, learning involves going back and forth between focusing and sort of diffuse consolidation. you're making sense of things in the background of the new things that you're trying to learn. And I should point out that Dr. Ambedkar, if you think about it, what he was able to do was, we often have these pre-existing set patterns in our mind. And sometimes because we have those patterns laid in, it's really hard to get out of them. It's something called Einstellung. So it's like your thinking is in a rut. And he was so brilliant that he was able to think creatively. He wasn't always just thinking in the ways about society and how society works, where it's always in the same patterns. He was able to draw back and look at new patterns and see things in a new and creative way. And so I'm convinced that he was not only able to make great use of his focused mode of thinking, but he was also able to step back, look in new ways, and that's indicative of that creative, diffuse mode kind of thinking. So anyway, learning involves going back and forth between those two different modes, and you can't be in one mode at the same time unless you're taking certain forms of mushrooms, and I'm not advocating that you take mushrooms, but knowledge of this is valuable in learning, because it tells you that if you don't understand something, for example, that first time that you see it, that's perfectly normal. That's perfectly understandable, because that's the way most people's brains work. And I think people are often successful even when it takes them a little while to learn about things, because they just kind of say, well, even if it takes me longer, I'm just going to be persistent. But if we know how our brain works, then that can kind of help us be aware that if we don't understand something the very first time we see it, or even the second or third time, that's perfectly normal. Just keep at it, and you can be successful.
Okay, so the challenge is doing something, then getting off your focus, and then looking back to it after some time, so that we can see that particular thing in a completely new light. Why are there only two modes of thinking, focus and diffuse, or are there more?
Well, that's a very good question. I'll just put forth one hypothesis, because we don't know for sure. There are, let's see, if you think about it, let's take a bird. From an evolutionary perspective, a bird has two challenges in order to stay alive. One is they need to be able to peck, to focus on whatever they're going to get, that piece of grain or food. The other thing is that they need to be aware of what's going on in the environment, because there could be some other bird that's going to come after them and attack them. So often it seems that birds, as well as virtually every other vertebrate animal, have to go back and forth between this focusing and more diffuse awareness. And so there's evidence in various animals that they also have these sort of two different modes, and it's because of two different evolutionary forces that seem to have had bearing in how we have turned out as as animals and as people today.
It's an evolutionary matter.
It looks like it, yes.
It's like an evolutionary. When I was young, or since a very long time, my parents, they were telling me that I have to be creative. My teachers, they were telling me that I have to think out of the box. And I learned from Steve Jobs that I have to put a dent in the universe. What is creativity? And how can we harness it?
I think that creativity is a much bigger enterprise than we often think it is. Even when you are learning something new, for example, you're learning how to do multiplication, and you're, 7, 8 years old. 2,000 years ago, you would have been an incredible genius to be learning multiplication like that. And it would have been considered the height of creativity if you could take those ideas and apply them to analyzing different ways of accounting for the collection of grains and various other commodities. So we sometimes discount what people commonly learn as being uncreative just because a lot of people are ultimately capable of doing it. But it's actually creativity. I think that creativity happens in many ways in our lives. It's when we sort of get out of the box of the typical way of thinking about things, as did Dr. Ambedkar. That we don't just take for granted the way people normally think. That's, I think, a very helpful aspect of creativity, and I think it involves being aware of when you are being closed-minded about things, which does not mean that you have to be open-minded about everything, because that way lies danger too. But it means being aware of when you are thinking about things and you've already come to a decision about things, but if you truly reflect and look at it in an intelligent way, there are other perspectives that can also add value. So creativity it's a very complex issue, but I think sort of being in touch with that back and forth, being creative isn't all diffuse mode activity, because we can have wild creative ideas, but taking them back to the focus mode and seeing if they're really useful, if they're implementable, if you can actually do it and understand it from a logical perspective. Yeah, between the both of those modes, that's where real creativity happens.
We can base creativity on the basis of how much we have evolved, about how much our societies have evolved, and creativity, I think everyone is creative.
I think everyone can be creative. One difficulty for very creative people is that often they run up against people who are used to the way that things have always been done, and it can take a lot of effort to overcome that. So there's this kind of push and pull. Although everyone has the possibility of being creative, not everyone supports the creative ideas of others, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes others' creative ideas may not be as helpful as they think they are.
Let us speak a bit about memory. We have heard a lot about short-term memory and long-term memory. What are the types of memory?
Well, there are many different ways to quantify, classify, and look at memory. So, in fact, memory is so complex, and we're learning more all the time, that for my purposes, for simplicity's sake, I think best in terms of short and long-term memory, or short-term is virtually synonymous with working memory. In other words, what we hold temporarily in mind. And working memory, it's like you can hold four things in working memory. On average, people can hold four sort of concepts at once. And that's still sort of a shorthand. There's some evidence it's like maybe two things is all we can hold. Certainly, if I haven't had my coffee yet, I can't hold more than two things in my working memory. But your working memory is in your prefrontal cortex, and it's what you can hold in mind temporarily right now. So like if I told you 4725, you could hold that, maybe if you're repeating it to yourself, 4725, and you can think of it as, it's filling 4 slots or something of that nature of working memory. But that contrasts, so it's like what you're holding right here. Now that contrasts with what's going on in your long-term memory. Your long-term memory is scattered all around your brain. Different areas hold information related to more specific sorts of things. But what happens is if you practice with an idea or if you use a trick to make it more visual, you can store things more easily in your long-term memory. So often storing something in long-term memory, unless you happen to be super genius IQ or very high IQ, it can be easier for you to store things in long-term memory, and you also have a larger working memory. But not to worry, if you're not a super genius, you still have some advantages. So at any rate, often it means when you are learning something new and you're trying to store it in long-term memory, you're basically making connections between neurons. So you're creating a pattern. And the more you practice that pattern, the stronger those synaptic connections between the neurons get, and the easier it is for you to draw that pattern up into your working memory. So that's why practice can be a very important part of learning. If you're learning a language, if you're learning math and science, practice and repetition, but done intelligently so that you're mixing things up. You're not just memorizing. Can be very valuable in building those long-term memory. You can call them a chain because it's a connection of neurons, or neuroscientists often call it a chunk. So if you have a good, strong working memory that can hold 8 things at once in it, and there are some people like that, you can draw all these chunks up and bring them into working memory and connect them together there, and it's easy for you to do really difficult things. But let's say you have a lousy working memory, like me, right? So what that means is that you have to work harder to create that chunk, that linked thing long-term for you. And that takes time. But once you create that pattern, it's like a simplified, nice chain or chunk that you can instantly reach into your working memory and draw that up. And you have simplified whatever you were learning so that you have a really simple, elegant understanding that oftentimes can be better than the person who's really super smart, and so they have all these different little bits and chains and so forth, and they can put it all together in their mind. They can't explain it very easily to others, and they haven't had to simplify and see the elegant essence that the person with a poorer working memory has had to do. So it can be very advantageous sometimes to have a working memory, which means you have to work harder in order to learn the same things as someone with a really good working memory. But you've got that elegant simplicity, and that can allow you to be more creative. The other thing is, if you have a rotten working memory, so let's say I've got 4 slots in my working memory, so I can pull things up, but my working memory is not very sticky. So I've got it all in working memory. It's all there, and then whoa, shiny, something distracts me, and then something falls out. But when something falls out, something else comes in. And that's why people with poor working memories can often be more creative. So again, do you have to work harder if you have a poor working memory? Yeah, but you would not want to trade the fact that you have a lot of creativity and you have an elegant ability to, with some work, simplify and see things in their essence that sometimes the genius types have trouble seeing.
So having a short working memory can be advantageous.
Exactly right. It can be advantageous to have a not so good working memory.
And with proper repetitions and doing things one after another, we can convert those chunks from short-term memory or working memory into long-term memory.
Right. And the way you want to repeat, though, is not by just memorizing it. Like, let's say that you are solving a problem using Bayes' theorem. So probability, you're solving a problem. You don't want to just sit there and go, okay, now memorize what's this step, here's the next step, I'm memorizing that. You want to say, here's the problem. Okay, I'll put that aside and let me see if I can solve it cold. Pull it from my own mind. If you get stuck, right, take a little look, get some, but the ultimate goal is you want to be able to solve that thing in your mind, pulling it from your own mind, not just regurgitating the memorized steps. And what that does is that builds a structured understanding of what's going on so that when you face a problem that's maybe a little different, you'll be able to see the commonalities and still be able to solve it. But it's almost like you want to be able to solve it so that you don't want to cheat. You don't want to sit there and say, yeah, I understand how to do that problem. That's good enough. Because that's cheating. Your mind doesn't, it's seeing the solution, thinking you have built the neural connections, but you haven't. And so you want to physically make yourself work that problem on a piece of paper. And then once you can do that, and you can do it again, and you can do it again, and you start to do it really swiftly, and you can do it, then after a while, you can just look at that problem and in your mind go, oh yeah, okay, I do this step, this step, this step, and it's almost like a song that flows through your mind. And then that means that you've created a solid chunk in your long-term memory. And that makes it easy to pull that chunk up and build new related chunks or just put it together in working memory, two things together. And then you can solve related problems or even see comparison with their very different areas, and you can be more creative with whatever you're working on related to that sort of concept.
Ma'am, you have been speaking about chunks. What exactly is it?
A chunk is, you can think of it as a neural chain, so you have built any kind of learning means that you have a neuron and you have made a connection to another neuron and another neuron and maybe another neuron. In fact, you have sort of a linked chain of neurons. That is what a chunk is. It's a pattern of connections. And at first, when you're first learning something, that pattern is very weak. The synaptic connections aren't very strong. But the more you practice with it, the sort of the bigger those synaptic connections become. And so it becomes, you can think of it as like a mouse in your brain, a mental mouse. And the more that mental mouse runs along that pathway, the thicker and broader that pathway becomes. So, and it's also very true that mice are nocturnal creatures. They like to run around at night. And indeed, when you are learning, what happens is, especially if you, once again, right before sleep, review what you really want to learn. And what that'll do is when you're sleeping, your mind goes along and practices running along that path, those connections. And they can see it happen. Neuroscientists can watch that repetition, how the brain is going over and consolidating those pathways. And that's why sleep is such an important part of learning. And it's important to space out. So 10 hours in a day learning something is not anything like as good as 10 days of 1 hour apiece. Because 1 hour each day, well, then you go to sleep at night, you grow more neural connections. Go to sleep the next night, more neural connections. You can only grow so many neural connections in an evening, right? So that's why it's important to do a little bit every day, because then that's where that strong neural architecture of learning takes place. Sometimes students can, if they cram, they can pass a test, but then what happens is, as the semester goes by and the material gets harder and harder, they start to feel lost. And it's because they've been cramming instead of doing a little study every day on that topic, which builds those solid connections and makes it so they have a good infrastructure. So when the material gets more difficult, they're able to handle it. If they just cram, it works at first. But then as the semester goes by, materials get more difficult, they find themselves become lost. And so that's why spacing out your learning is such an important thing to do. And getting good sleep, because sleep is such an important part of learning.
So it is much better to learn something, the same material, over a course of a few days rather than on a single day.
Precisely correct. Precisely correct.
Let us go to the most dreaded topic, procrastination. Like, I know what I'm going to do tomorrow, I have planned it all, and I know I have to get up tomorrow at 5 a.m. I've set up all of my alarms, like 1 at 4, 4:10, 4:30, 4:40, 4:45, 5, and exactly at 4, I just switch them all off. Or let us say that I know what I have to do and I have a week to do something, but I'll do that particular thing only just a day before that particular event is going to happen. Why? Why do we procrastinate? What exactly is procrastination?
Well, you've just brought up two different aspects of procrastination. One relates to sleep. So people need, on average, about 8 hours of sleep. Okay. And if you are they're about 0.1% of the population has a short sleep gene. Okay. So odds are you are not one of those people. Whoever you are probably not, unless you consistently through your life have slept, through most of your adult life, have slept maybe 4 hours a day or a night, then maybe you have this gene. But otherwise, you are probably like a typical person and you need around 8 hours of sleep. So you can only run on a sleep deficit for so long before it starts to catch up with you. And then you're not going to learn very well if you're getting up at 4 in the morning and you've only had 3 hours of sleep, just because you haven't had time to consolidate whatever you've been learning the night before. And also, sleep is when you wash away toxins in your brain. Your brain cells shrink during sleep time. And that's what allows the toxins to be washed away. But normally, the neurons are very large during the day, and they block the flow of cerebral fluids that take out the toxins. But so anyway, sleep is super important. And if you find yourself sleeping through the alarms, that's probably because you're not getting enough sleep. But on the other hand, procrastination happens in part for a very simple reason. When you even just think about something you don't want to do and you don't like, it activates the pain center of the brain. And that pain center makes it so you automatically go, I think I want to do something different. Because if you even just think, well, I'm going to do my economics now. I don't want to do my economics. I'm going to go to my favorite social website. And instantly you feel better because you're not thinking about that thing that's creating pain. But of course, it's almost like an addiction. It makes you feel better to switch your thoughts to something else, but you've just procrastinated. And if you do that very often, that kind of addictive behavior can have terrible consequences on your ability to be successful. In fact, you can even think that you can't do a particular topic or subject, that you don't have these skills or ability when it has nothing to do with that. It's just the fact that you procrastinated until the last minute, and few people can learn under those circumstances. So always my recommendation in these kinds of things, the simplest, cheapest, easiest thing to do is to use the Pomodoro technique, which was invented by an Italian, Francesco Cedillo, in the 1980s. So easy. And when I teach the course with Terry Sinowski, Learning How to Learn, people love this technique. It is like the favorite, and they find it so incredibly useful. It's almost like a form of working meditation. And all you have to do is first turn off anything that will interrupt you. So, for example, turn off any kind of little alarms or buzzers on your cell phone or any pop-ups on your computer. Turn off your kid brother, if possible, or whatever. And try to get in a situation where you're not going to be interrupted. And then set a timer. Any timer will do. I have a little timer that I've downloaded onto my laptop that I use. Some people use Pomodoro timers. A very popular one is called Forest. And then you set that timer for 25 minutes. And then you just work as intently as you can for 25 minutes. So sometimes you will find that thoughts will arise that distract you. Like sometimes I'll be working away and work really hard. I am just working so hard, and I look up at my timer, and I've just done 2 minutes of the Pomodoro. And my mind screams, I cannot do another 20 minutes. And I just let that thought drift right on by, and I return my focus to whatever I'm working on, because the reality is that anybody can do 25 minutes. And then the most important thing is when you're done, you give yourself a reward. And you might think, oh, I don't need to do a reward. I'm just going to keep working. But that reward is critical, because what it does is it helps train your brain so that it enjoys the period of attention, that focusing time. It's a little bit like Pavlov's dog. When Pavlov, he would sound the bell, and then the dogs would begin to salivate. They'd get so excited because they knew that food was coming. Food wasn't presented right away, but it was coming. And they get all happy during that time because they knew they were going to get this little reward. And it's like that for you. You're training your brain that at the end of this focus period, you're going to get a reward. Now, sometimes I will go longer. If I really get into the flow of things, I will allow myself to go longer than 25 minutes. But when I'm done, I always give myself a reward. And now, after having done this for a long time, I find that even when I just set the timer and start a Pomodoro, I feel this sort of enthusiasm, even if it's something that I really didn't want to do, because I know it's only 25 minutes, even if sometimes it goes longer.
So let us talk about Pomodoro. Pomodoro is 25 minutes of focused thinking, and then 5 minutes or 10 minutes of diffuse thinking, and then again 25 minutes of focused thinking. And
that's a good way to do it.
Okay.
If you find that you're having trouble with going longer on your breaks than you should, then set a time for however long you want to take the break for. So if it's 10 minutes or 5 minutes, set the timer for that, and that can help you keep on track.
Okay, and then we should have a kind of reward system so that we would stay motivated all along the way.
Right. So the reward can be anything. It can be, let's say, it doesn't need to be food. It can be, let's say that you have a favorite song.
Okay.
You can listen to your favorite song during that break. Maybe you can even dance to the favorite song. I think Bollywood movies are so awesome because they have such great dancing. And but maybe there's a video game that you like, or there's lots of different things that you can do to help yourself enjoy that period of relaxation. A good thing to do, however, is let's say that you're writing a report during those 45 minutes. During the break, try to do something that doesn't involve writing, because you're using the same part of the brain and you're just making it more tired. So just try to do something that's going to use some very different area. Often doing something physical is really the best break that you can give yourself. But as long as it's different, that's very helpful. But I should mention that exercise is a very important part of learning. We now understand that what exercise does is it helps produce BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and that is like a fertilizer for the neurons in your brain, and it helps them to grow better. So it also, exercise seems to help new neurons be born, neurogenesis. There's some evidence of that. So don't neglect exercise. If you find that your attention wanders and you have trouble keeping your focus, a good thing to do is whenever you find yourself losing focus, do a couple push-ups or some jumping jacks or something. So whenever you find yourself during a Pomodoro losing your focus like that, do something physical for just to get yourself back. So like 10 jumping jacks, 5 push-ups or something like that. When you come back, you'll find that you're able to focus again more effectively.
About motivation, I remember a quote of Jim Rohn. You say that motivation don't last, so neither does bathing or brushing, and that is why we have to do it daily.
That is a very good way of, let's see, you continually want to remotivate yourself. If you find yourself losing motivation, you're perfectly normal. It's just like people finding themselves needing a shower, and you just take a shower to get yourself refreshed. So sometimes it's valuable to watch motivational videos and to read motivational books, because real life can sometimes be difficult. And when we see the example of really inspirational people, it can help us in our own lives.
I have a question here from someone, ma'am.
Okay.
What if I have put something in my long-term memory and it's not really pleasant and I want to erase it? Can that happen?
Oh, yes, I'm not an expert on this because because I've never been asked this question before, because usually people want to put things into their long-term memory and not remove them. I understand, let's see, if I remember correctly, now I'm not certain of this, I'd have to go back and check the literature again, but there was something about kind of thinking about it backwards, sort of recalling it in reverse somehow seemed to help erase it. And also I think that sometimes these if they're if they've made an emotional impact on you, these kinds of thoughts can be sort of difficult to deal with. So a good book is one by Dr. David Burns. And he talks about the different ways that our brain it can illogically and emotionally assign values to what has happened to you, and he gives you specific cognitive skills about how to sort of reframe it in your brain so that it takes away the pain. So, for example, let's say that you said something to someone else and you felt as if it was the wrong thing to say and you really regret it. He will talk about how you're maybe imagining what that person is saying, and so the way you feel about it feels so real to you that you feel that must be the reality. And so he gives you all sorts of categories of theological thinking, and so I highly recommend Dr. David Byrne's book.
Let us move to a very important topic. Are tests important? I mean, I have learned everything, I know everything, but I just don't want to appear for the test. I mean, I know everything just a minute before the test has begun, and the minute after, I know nothing. I'm all blank. Are tests really important?
That again is a good question. Yes, they are important. We found that, for one thing, if you spend 1 hour taking a test versus just 1 hour studying, you will learn far more in that 1 hour of test taking. You're stressed. It's like it potentiates different activations, and so you're thinking about it, and when you're even preparing for the test, you're learning more deeply because you know you want to take this test. Even if it feels like you're forgetting a lot of the stuff afterwards, well, you do have to look at how you're learning, because if you cram for 10 hours the day before the test and then take it, it's going to be easy to forget everything afterwards. But if you've been studying well, kind of consistently all the way along, sure, you're going to forget some things after the test, but it will be much more deeply embedded in your brain because you've had to take this test than if people just say, well, it's whatever you learned in this course, you just wouldn't study as effectively. And there's another thing too. Sure, tests can be overdone, and people can study for tests instead of for the knowledge. But it's really hard to get an understanding of whether somebody actually knows the material unless you give them a test. So, for example, in the United States, I saw, I often worked in a disadvantaged school district. And when there were no statewide tests, no, the school district didn't care. And the only time I saw them actually begin to care about, well, we have to teach these kids something, was when there became some standardized tests and then the teachers were held accountable. So you will fairly often see teachers say, oh, we hate tests. They're really bad. They make us work too hard for them. People are studying for them. We're teaching them tests. But part of that animosity towards tests is because it holds teachers accountable. And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
We have a notion that we should start off with the simplest questions first. Is it true?
If you have not studied at all, yes, it is true. Just take whatever points you can get, and you're going to be lucky to get what you can get. But if you have prepared fairly well for the examination, your best approach is to start with the hardest. Like, look over the test quickly, grab the problem that looks like it's the hardest, and start working on it. And then, usually within 1 to 2 minutes, you get a sense of, I don't know what I'm doing. And, you feel this kind of panic in your stomach because you're just like, and sometimes what people will do is they'll just keep going at it. But what you want to do is force yourself, as soon as you feel that stuck feeling, you'll feel it in your stomach. Then let go work on it easier. And then what will happen is, while you're working on that easier problem, so that's your focus mode. Your diffuse mode will be working in the background on the other problem. And so maybe work that easier problem, maybe another problem, maybe go to another difficult problem. Oh, you're stuck on that one. So then go back to the first one, and you'll be surprised. You can make progress on that first problem because you've let that diffuse mode work away in the background on the problem. So it can be a very good idea. It's what I call hard start. Start with the hardest and then jump to easy and let both modes of your brain be working in parallel. And it's a good way to be more successful at tests.
So hard start, jump to easy.
Right. And part of what that does is, I think the biggest mistake that we technical types often make is we're tenacious. Once we start a problem, we don't want to let it go. And we feel like, oh, if we let it go, we're somehow not being persistent and we're not completing. And so we don't train ourselves to let go for a while. Let that other mode work in the background. And if you practice, even on your homework, practice this hard start, jump to easy, and then when you're on tests, it will seem more natural for you. And you'll see that using sort of both modes, one's working on another problem while you're focusing on, a different problem, then you're using sort of both ways of thinking very effectively, to do better on your tests.
So should we move towards our last question?
Oh, that's the toughest one.
How do you see the world a decade from now on? What are your expectations from learners like us, and what do you wish to achieve ultimately?
Well, I think that effective learning of the kind that we have just spoken of today involves a lot of really simple ideas that haven't been communicated. There's been unbelievably fantastic research that's been done. But often this work has been done, but it isn't being conveyed to students so students can use it practically, even though they're simple ideas when you really think about them, especially if you have a bad short-term working memory like mine, then you really understand that they're actually very simple ideas. So I think the biggest thing what I hope that the future will hold is that more and more people will become aware of these ideas. So I wrote the book, A Mind for Numbers, that conveys these ideas. And then I did, with Terry Smelsky, the massive open online course, Learn How to Learn, which conveys these ideas and is free. So essentially, if you want to see the ideas really simply on videos, then you can go to Learn How to Learn, and that is the free MOOC from Coursera, massive open online course from Coursera. If you want to go more deeply, go to A Mind for Numbers, the book. But the next thing I'm looking to do is to create, I wrote a book with Terry for children.
Okay.
And it has these ideas, and they're basically, any kid that's 10 years old and up, it's really easy to understand these ideas. So Terry and I did a book, and we're creating free videos that convey these ideas for kids. And what I want to do is have these videos available by native speakers of languages from around the world, as in Hindi, for example. So now I have, there's groups in Portuguese, Spanish, Arabic, Russian, and so forth. So I hope that there will be a group in India that might be interested in making these videos available for kids for free. And then we can really help produce a new generation that is much more capable of learning effectively, starting from very young ages.
This is my copy of a Mind for Numbers. I hope this is the book you were talking about.
Yeah, that's the book. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, ma'am, for writing this book, and thank you very much for being here and educating us all on how there is a difference between the focus mode and diffuse mode, working memory and long-term memory, how we can tackle procrastination, and giving us a lot of valuable tips, learning about Pomodoro techniques, and how test taking is actually good, and what your world vision is. Thank you very much for being here and enlightening us. We wish you very, very good luck for your future. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to share it with you. Best of luck and happy learning.
Wish you luck and happiness. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you.